I'm pleased to be joined by John Doboseiwics of Future City and a professor at Kean University to talk about Environmental Day 2012 here in the city of Elizabeth. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on again.
Good to see you, John.
It becomes an annual event. Much like spring, as you mentioned before, once it rolls around, we expect to get outdoors and get our students involved in learning much more about the environment. Through Future City and the Watershed Association, we developed, at first it was an Earth Day in conjunction with Earth Day, and broadened it more to an environmental approach to engage more people who were probably unfamiliar maybe with what Earth Day might have been, which developed in the 70s as a grassroots event that people started to look at the Earth in a very future forward way. And one of the things that Future City focuses on is indeed in the name of the organization in what the future of the city looks like, and that means looking at the environment, but also, as you mentioned before, that the environment activities that we do need to come through our students, because those will be the stewards of the future of the watershed. And it's certainly an interesting watershed. We've talked about it a number of times, an estuary, which is a place that not everyone's familiar with, where ocean water and fresh water come and mix, creating a very unique ecosystem. So one of the hopes really for Future City's work is to really create a watershed that people think about in an environmental way, in a recreational way, in a fishable way, and in a safe way. Obviously it has great economic importance to this region, and there will be other presentations, I'm sure, about some of the other activities going on.
Now, John, your background is in earth sciences. You teach that at Kean University, right? So this is just an extension of your life's work.
I've been teaching earth science for in the 20-year range. I was a former high school teacher and then began teaching at Kean University in 2001. Recently, I've taken on more general responsibilities for our students at the university, but I still teach the Earth Science Senior Capstone Seminar course and teach an introductory Earth Science course. So yes, it certainly is something I care about. The university as a whole is very active in this region, not just in the sciences, but in the humanities, with developing those relationships between getting high school students college ready.
You know, this has nothing to do with the subject, but I have to ask you because you're the only guy I know with this background. But in the New York Times yesterday, they had a story about a guy who went 7 miles in the ocean underneath. What could he possibly find 7 miles down in the water? That's a long way.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't read the article,
yeah.
And
what could be there?
The deep trenches are a place of intrigue. I'll give you a brief lesson on plate tectonics. So if you take out a map, you would probably notice that Africa and South America seem to fit together. So in the 1900s, a scientist named Wegener first proposed this theory of continental drift. To get to the point, the real story behind this idea that continents were at one time once together and moved is underneath the ocean floors. So or underneath water, and then there's rock there. So that is a place of active research for people to get at this deep theory about how these continents have probably moved. In a very practical way today, this is all connected to earthquakes. So I think we had a recent event in Japan that was a fairly high seismic event. So understanding,
we even had one here in the summer.
Well, we had one
small, yeah, but we had one here in August.
And we're not no place is immune to the earthquake, and the ocean floors are really one of the key pieces of understanding things like earthquakes much better. Again, on our coastlines, our coastline here is a passive coastline in terms of earthquake activity. The Pacific Ocean, much more active current coastline. But we have faults all across New Jersey that were developed on a geologic time scale.
And that has to do with the continents possibly spreading apart hundreds of thousands of years ago or millions of years ago.
In the millions, and it's part of you know, the theory was developed in the 1900s. It's still being developed as we speak today, as most science is
So
still being developed.
going in the water 7 miles down will help answer some of those questions.
That would be my guess. It might also have.
It was just a real small article. They didn't get into theory at all.
The other thing about the ocean relationship and possibly closer to shore is that there is life, and that's a relatively new discovery, because most scientists a couple of centuries ago believed that nothing could live on the bottom of the ocean because there was no light. And light drives our ecosystems, especially in an estuarine environment. And actually, this plate activity on the ocean bottoms actually creates a new form of energy on Earth. In sunlight, we have photosynthesis, and on the bottom of the ocean, it's called chemosynthesis, where different chemicals drive a food chain. So that connection is very real, and those same organisms could potentially migrate across those ocean layers.
Now, John, back to the Environmental Day, you said it started off as Earth Day, which is on April 22nd, and Environmental Day has grown from there in the city of Elizabeth. And you've met a lot of the students through the years that have done this program with you in Future City. What are some of the reactions from the students when they actually get to touch the fish and see what's going on in the Arthur Kill?
Well, I think that summarizes really what the point of all this work is about. Because if we don't get to a point where those organisms are no longer the shock that they really are, so that's what we get. We get students who, on first glance, would say nothing can live there, much like the ocean bottom. It's too dark, it's dirty, nothing can survive. So the real answer is when we get to a point where that's no longer a mystery, and we can take the next step towards learning more about these species, asking deeper questions like, are these the right species? Because some are opportunistic species that maybe aren't the history of this ecosystem, where the organisms that are there are simply there because they're stronger in a world that was industrialized. But much of the organisms that we want to get back are those that were more native to the area, the more native fishes, as well as all the other organisms.
Crabs would be one of the ones.
Crabs are also native too, but they're fairly resilient. And getting to a point where our students recognize that this is really as healthy of an ecosystem as we can imagine.
Now, in your time here, you've been doing this for a number of years in Elizabeth, but in your time of looking at the Arthur Kill, it's cleaner.
The water is absolutely cleaner, because many laws have been in place since the 70s, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. But one limit of the laws is that it typically targets what would be considered the point polluters. That a company, for example, that would in the 50s have no regulation and could easily have a pipe containing chemicals that would discharge right into the water. So all of that is very regulated by our governmental structures. What's not as regulated are some of our land use practices, which we need to have decisions on based on economic structures, as well as social structures, as well as environmental impacts. And the area that a lot of watersheds focus on would be considered non-point source pollution. So if you're washing your car and some material comes off of your car, it's going to end up in the waterway. A lot of the activities that we've worked collaboratively on with the city are the storm drain markings, which you've seen, and that's one educational aspect of getting people more familiar with the idea that everything you do on land has an impact in the watershed. And water is, in chemistry classes, typically called the universal solvent, because it will dissolve almost anything you drop on the ground. So anything that's left there when it rains, water has a high affinity to dissolve that material, transport it. We have drains that we need to keep the streets from flooding, and unfortunately sometimes those drains go right into the water, and there's no remediation of any material along the way. It's certainly not not the worst type of pollution, but it prohibits the ecosystem from developing further. A lot of the things that go into the waterways are nutrients. And nutrients on the surface would seem good because we need nutrients to survive as living organisms. But usually what happens with nutrients as water is that it builds up the plant community. And if you have too many plants, it overpopulates the water. It becomes actually too green, more than the ecosystem can eat. It's much like having more food. If you have
like a pack-on's dealing with.
If you have excess food that you can't eat, it ends up somewhere else.
So, like a pack-on's got all these weeds growing underneath it. There's nobody eating it, right? So
Absolutely.
they have to then harvest all that to maintain the recreational aspects of the lake. The students, you talked about not understanding how clean the ecosystem is. Do you think any students actually come to this and say, hey, I may want to pursue this as life's work? I mean, do you think there's a few? Have you talked to a few that get motivated in that direction?
Many students from Kane University are from the city of Elizabeth, and I do teach a freshman course, and I would usually ask the students where they're from, and I don't know every student, but many of them that I talk to are, when we're at the university, they're familiar with participating in the event. So one of the challenges of the educational process is we're in a curriculum that is highly demanding, and we want to have environmental education, and fitting that in the curriculum and in the day is a constant work because of the other demands of the educational needs of students. So we'd like to have more. We'd like to have a better ability to really track students. We have that conversational sense that it does work. We certainly know that these events that you've attended in the past, students are highly energized.
Well, they are.
But can we continue energizing them through the year? And that's where we need to keep working with our schools. One of the things we've implemented at Kane is something called Environmentors. And it has some funding from a national agency, a national environmental and science group that partners high school students with college students. And Future City facilitates a lot of that work where we have high school students working on actual mini research projects with the mentorship of someone from the university, either a faculty member or an undergraduate student. And we were able to actually take 3 students last year from the Elizabeth High School system to Washington, D.C., where they presented posters at a national competition. So that's the kind of work we need to do more of, where we really take these students and move them into these environmental careers. We have all the infrastructure in place. It's just a matter of a little bit more time to make that happen. But overall, everyone's going to live somewhere, and they will likely live near a water body. So the idea of
3/4 of the earth is covered with water, right?
And population lives close to water. You can't really develop a population well unless you're close to water.
Please stay with us. We're going to do some commercials and then come back and talk more about Environmental Day.
Thank you.
For Professor John Doboseiwics, I'm Chris Bolwage. Please stay with us after these messages. Welcome back to our city. I'm pleased to be joined by Professor John Doboseiwics of Kane University, talking about Environmental Day 2012 in the city of Elizabeth. And Professor, the nuts and bolts, the things that we do here on the waterfront and the educational aspect of Environmental Day, maybe you can share with our viewers some of that.
Well, first I'd like to just share the date. We're hosting
That's probably
the event
important.
April 20th. So it's a couple of Fridays from now. You started the show talking about this moving us towards April. And usually we do the show a little bit closer to the event, but this is a good time just as well. And I'll give you some more information about the website, which is www.futurecityinc.org. Or if anyone was interested in more details, you can dial 908-659-0689. The event that we host in the spring is held at the Elizabeth Marina, which, again, a great partnership with the city of Elizabeth. And throughout the day, we invite various students from different schools in the city, and they participate in one of the highlights being a boat ride on the Arthur Kill and up towards the Newark Bay complex. On that boat ride, which is sponsored by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, There'll be discussions about the dredging project as well as ecosystem restoration, probably pointing out the Jersey Garden Mall, which is an environmental restored site, which now has great economic value. On land, we also have presentations from the New York, New Jersey Baykeeper. There's an initiative that we've worked on for a few years on oysters, which at a time were central to the ecosystem in this area. So that's ongoing work, and there's typically a presentation on the oyster food network and how they're an essential, referred to as a keystone species in developing a healthy food chain. We also have presentations from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. They usually do a watershed model, and specifically what we talked about earlier in the show, lesson on non-point source pollution. And Kean University does a presentation on our clean water activities, different tests that we do to determine the water quality.
And John, the work at Kean University and Future City, they kind of come together too.
Well, we've worked together on a number of projects. I mentioned before the Environmentor project, which is one of the highlights of our initiative right now. But we have a lot of students from the university who work at Future City and continue to support these initiatives.
Now, one of the things that we always have talked about in the past, you and I, is addressing the issues to young people as opposed to adults or in concert with adult residents. Who do you think the better audience is? Should we go after adults and then they can set an example for the younger residents, or younger residents and start a foundation for the future? It's kind of like a chicken and egg syndrome.
Well, the answer I give every year is with our young people. And it's also forged by being a parent myself, where although I work in an educational system, I don't necessarily understand everything that's happening in elementary schools and middle schools. So I actually rely on my own children.
How old are they?
To keep me updated. They're from elementary school up to high school now.
Oh, okay.
So it's about thinking of it in the way that the students are really the educators for their household. Most people didn't take an environmental course in any educational way. So the idea of...
I did not.
You did not. So the idea of environmental education is a somewhat new idea. It's not as broad a curriculum as math, science, reading. So it lives in a space in American education that is not as firm as maybe some of the more discipline-based science like biology, where you probably took a biology course or a chemistry course, or maybe even a physics course. So the idea of environmental education...
I had enough with biology and chemistry. I didn't do physics courses.
Well, that's okay. You can always go back to school now for one. And that's why you need to know that, because earthquakes are all based on physics and geophysics. And so the idea that turning the students into the real leaders of the future by empowering them with not just the education but the experience, because what you learn in the classroom takes you a limited way. All the audience will know that. The textbook knowledge is great and it's necessary, but unless you have that experience that connects you with the issue at hand, something is still lacking. So the idea of creating our future leaders through the schools is the focus of how we should approach this. Not that parents can't support this, but thinking about how education should be, where parents are working and they have jobs and they have other commitments. And imagine the household where a kid comes home and is forcing the parents to think environmentally, where they weren't taught that way, and how proud a parent would be if they're, even if it's not graded, but their child shows an aptitude or an interest in something that they were probably not very familiar with.
And Professor, in your opinion, the local impact Environmental Day has on the residents. I mean, we bring a lot of young people there and we talk with their parents and the young people, but the residents gravitate to the pier as well. What do you think that impact is?
Well, we talk to residents quite often at the waterfront. At Slater Park specifically, we've done some cleanup initiatives, and we know that they're interested. And what they're still clamoring for is that level of information. So the real hope is that in their communities we develop these structures through Future City where residents can, through a community organization, really find the resources they need. They're not likely to come to Kane University and try to navigate a college to find this. But Future City is the resource, the repository of all these activities. And that's what community engagement's about, engaging each individual in their space and in their time to commit to this work.
And the Future City has a website, which if you can give us to our viewers one more time, where they can get information on this day.
Yes, the website is futurecityinc.org.
And Professor, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us on the show this evening, and I look forward to seeing you at the end of April for Environmental Day, wrapped around Earth Day here in the city of Elizabeth.
Great. Thanks for having me on.
For Professor John Doboseiwics at Kane University, on behalf of Future City here in the city of Elizabeth and Michelle McBean, I'm Chris Bolwage. We'll see you next week on another edition of Our City.